Recording with the one and only Mr. Richard Rhodes on Tuesday, July 16th, 2024 at 12:36 p.m. Eastern Time. You've been on here multiple times before, making the atomic bomb, Dark Sun, Energy, and we've gone and the one I probably talk about the most of your books, the Masters of Death, SS Einsatzgruppen, and many more books. I can't pull them up off the top of my head that we've discussed. And I thought I was being smart and pre-planning. I was like, 'cause I had to reschedule on you, and then I realized the date coming up. I was like July 16th. I was like 79th anniversary of the Alamogordo test, and I was like, this is gonna be great. And then, on Saturday, somebody took a shot at Trump, and it was like, well, that kind of goes out the window. And but luckily, you are also the author of many books on the psychology of violence, so it actually works out well. So, uh, I don't know how much we can get into the A bomb right now, or how much you want to just jump onto the Trump assassination attempt. But you take it in whatever direction you feel fit.
Let me help people just understand what was going on because they were testing the plutonium bomb, which was a whole new way of detonating a nuclear explosion. And that's why they had to test it. They weren't 100% sure it would work. So they fortunately had enough plutonium that they could use some to, if you will, make the bomb go off at full yield and see if it worked. And the way the system worked was, I've got a little model here I can actually show people. And it gives you a sense of just how this is the bomb core. Wait, I'm not, where
Yeah,
am I?
hold it up a little, hold it up a little higher. There we are. Yeah.
Here's the bomb core, which was surrounded by various metal structures. That little tiny ball in the middle is the plutonium. To give you another sense of how little material was involved, here is a crystal ball my children had made for me. That's roughly the size of the plutonium core of the bomb. It was a Christmas present one year. So it's about 3¼ inches, about 6 kilograms of pure plutonium 239. It was in two pieces, so they could put a little tiny uh, acorn-sized sphere in between the two parts that was designed to produce a few neutrons just at the moment when the squeeze,
Hmm.
you see what all the explosives are about, they're to squeeze that solid ball of plutonium to a greater density. And by doing that, they turned it into a critical mass and it started a fast neutron chain reaction. So it was really a very complicated problem. 1945 was the year that the first idea for a digital computer came along, and didn't exist. So people had to do all this calculating by hand, and it was very complicated. This little ball, whoops, there, here, I'm going to put it back in its little case so you can get a better sense of this thing was there. This
Yeah.
thing was 6 feet across,
Yeah. The
and that little
gadget.
ball, 1/4 inches. So you can get a sense of just what a massive explosive had to be had to surround that little sphere in order to squeeze a ball of solid metal to half its former size. It turns out you can do that. And when you do that, you push the atoms closer together. And so the neutrons that have to find uranium atoms and start them fissioning can find them more easily because they're all closer together. That was the trick. Uh, but making the 32 detonation points around the outside of this sphere all go off in a millionth of a second simultaneity, so that explosions that would normally go outward from a point are turned around by the shaped charges that are built around. This is, of course, a cutaway. It would be a solid ball of explosives. Turned around by the shaped charges to cause the shock wave to converge on a point, that point being the exact center of this tiny little ball. So it was a massive engineering problem, such that no one had ever worked it out before. And it took everyone at Los Alamos working night and day to figure it out. Uh, The result, however, was an explosion of about 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent. That little, where's my little sphere? This little sphere,
There you are.
there we are. This little sphere, 15,000 tons. Another way to think of it is that a nuclear reaction is about 4 million times as efficient as a normal chemical explosive reaction. That's why you can have so little of the material. That's why nuclear power plants are small for the energy they produce, compared, for example, to solar or wind,
Sure.
which has to be spread miles and miles of landscape. So the test worked. And anyone who saw the Oppenheimer movie remembers we were in an IMAX theater on the 7th row and had no idea what was coming when the flash occurred, because the director wisely understood that the light would reach you immediately, but it would take about 20 seconds for the sound wave, the blast wave, to get to where you were 20 miles away. So we were just about blown out of our seats when the shockwave from the explosion finally reached us, and that was just speakers in a movie. These guys were blown over who were 20 miles away watching the test. So it worked, and that meant that they could ship not only the uranium bomb, for which they only had enough uranium for one of that design, but also plutonium bombs. And that was the Nagasaki bomb. There was a third bomb core ready to go on the 10th of August. And Oppenheimer wrote General Groves, who ran the Manhattan Project, saying if we make mixed cores of uranium and plutonium, we can, by the beginning of October, have enough material to make 6 bombs a month. So it's good that the Japanese surrendered when they did, because we would have continued atomic bombing, a country that was already essentially, its cities already destroyed by firebombing. That brings us, of course, to the subject of violence. But let me just finish this
Sure.
little bit about the test. The test was crucial to President Truman, who was at that time in Potsdam in Germany, negotiating with Stalin and Winston Churchill over how to divide Europe up after the war. Truman was trying to get Stalin to come into the war as soon as possible before the test. But once he knew the bomb worked, he did everything he could think of to keep Stalin out of the Eastern War. The Soviet Union had not fought on the Eastern Front up to that time. And we didn't want to see Japan divided up the way Germany was divided up after the war into communist zones and Western zones. And we didn't want Stalin to come in and take apart the entire industrial capacity of Japan, as he did with Germany. I mean, they shipped whole factories and railroad trains and everything back to the Soviet Union from Germany at the end of the Second World War. They just stripped the country of its industrial capacity because they were behind themselves and needed it. So once Truman got word from the Trinity test through General Groves that the bomb worked, he then started trying to encourage Stalin to stay out. Stalin had said he would enter the war by attacking Manchuria, where the Japanese were entrenched, the last army really of the Japanese had at that point in the war. Stalin had fresh forces lined up ready to go, and he had said he would come in on the 15th of August. Truman now realized that the war might be over by the 15th of August, and we could keep the Soviets away. But Stalin, of course, had spies all over the Manhattan Project, and he had an observer for the Nagasaki bomb explosion and the Hiroshima bomb explosion as part of the Allies, because we were allies at that point. The message came back to Stalin and some early film footage showing what happened to Hiroshima. And he immediately realized the bomb, as he had believed all through the war, wasn't just some kind of disinformation to try to get him to waste a lot of money working on some stupid idea about nuclear explosions.
Yeah,
So he
yeah.
came or on the 8th of August rather than the 15th of August. And it was that rather than just the bombs themselves. That is to say, armies attacking, closing in on Japan now from two sides, us in the West and the Soviets in the East. It was that challenge that led the Japanese leadership finally to decide to surrender. So
Didn't know that.
although it's true that the bombs themselves brought about the end of the war. They contributed in important ways. There's kind of a revisionist argument lately that it was the Soviets coming into the war that ended the war, and there's truth to that. But it's also true that the bombs made it clear that the Japanese really had no alternatives unless they wanted their country completely destroyed. All that from this little
Uh,
tiny.
and and what was the ball in the center of that? Was it beryllium? The acorn?
It was a little shell of beryllium and a little shell of polonium, which is a very intensely radioactive element that were separated by a very thin layer of something
Tritium. Oh,
that blocked alpha particles from the polonium. So when the shock wave finally reached the center of this explosion, it crushed that little ball. And in doing so, combined beryllium and plutonium. And the alphas particles from the polonium, sorry, knocked neutrons out of the beryllium. And if you think about how many would be knocked out, it would be billions within a fraction of a second, but only about 5 or 6 were available in that millionth of a second as the explosion squeezed the plutonium to a critical mass. That's all they needed. They just wanted to start the reaction. Once those neutrons got going, then the chain reaction of the uranium atoms splitting, producing 2 new neutrons or 3 new neutrons every time an atom split, fed the reaction, and it within a thousandth or less of a second was producing 15,000 tons of TNT explosive force. It's the most extraordinary reaction, and I think people don't quite realize just how unusual it looks from the outside to those of us who are used to thinking of large fires or buildings blowing up or the normal scale of things. This is a different world entirely.
I've read it so many times, and it's still I'm just sitting here kind of shaking. Like I've read about this exact. I've read your books so many times, and it still sometimes just hits me just how. I mean, it's if to the uninitiated, it seems like wizardry, right?
Yeah, well, like wizardry, and for the time and place, in a way, it was.
Yeah,
It was
it's
brand new, and it changed the world without question. Uh, I was thinking about. I may have lost my thought here. Just a moment.
wizardry
Um,
to the uninitiated compared to buildings blowing up.
our standard bombs these days, a standard M62 bomb that is our standard hydrogen bomb, has a yield of 300,000 kilotons, not 15. A 15 kiloton bomb today is considered a tactical nuclear weapon, a weapon to be used on the battlefield to take out a bridge or a line of tanks. 300,000 kilotons, if exploded over the Pentagon, would take out all of Washington, D.C. with mass fire all the way out to the Rim Road 128 around the city. And that's our standard bomb. We had much bigger ones during the height of the Cold War.
Yeah.
That's why the scientists believed and hoped that these weapons that they were working on, which they felt pretty bad about working on in a way, I mean, this was a weapon of mass destruction of terrible force with really no other use except to destroy cities and kill human beings, uh, hoped that these weapons would be so destructive that they would end war, which they didn't do, of course. But what they did do was end world scale war. We've had no World War I's or World War II's since 1945. And I don't think there's much question but that nuclear weapons are what have kept the kind of relative peace. There were 15 million people killed in the most destructive year of World War II, 1943. And that was the highest number of people ever killed in a year in wartime throughout human history. But by 1945, with the end of the Second World War, no wars, singly or collectively, have led to more than 1 or 2 million deaths a year. And that's nothing to be proud of, to be
No.
sure. Long way from world scale war. 80 million at least human beings died in the Second World War. 80 million human beings.
And don't forget relative populations. Wasn't the world at 2 billion people in 45?
Ah, yeah, it probably was.
So multiply that by four. That's,
Yeah,
that'd be 60 million a year today. 15 is
yeah.
the highest and 43. That'd be 60 right now.
So what is all this violence about? Why are we talking about a guy trying to kill the president, the
Mhm.
former president? Who was this kid? He was 20 years old. He delivered food service in a rest home. He'd been bullied all through high school, a classic example. Uh, his dad liked guns and taught his son to like guns. And this kid who was beaten up all the time by and pushed around by all the other kids in his high school suddenly was in command of a powerful weapon which could be used to change history. And I'm quite sure he knew that. I'm quite sure that was his purpose.
Of course.
And it ties back in with the whole deep question of what human violence is about. So let me run through something quickly of the history of human violence because people don't, I think, really realize quite how it all came about. We are certainly animals designed to be able to use physical force and to destroy things. It's there primarily, I presume, from the beginning as a way of collecting our food, as we did on the open plains of East Africa 200,000 million years ago. But and that those skills are available to be used against each other as well. So before there were governments that took control of violence by professionalizing a police and most of all by introducing courts of law where you could negotiate your differences without killing each other. Before that, how did people control violence? Paradoxically, they controlled violence with violence. If you think about the clans of Scotland, if you think about the hillbillies of West Virginia and my home country, southern Missouri and Arkansas, they used violence basically to get back at, to take revenge on, to make it clear that there's a price to pay if you attack them or their families, the people they value. That's basically what we have militaries for, theoretically at least, to protect our country and our people and themselves and each other. So violence was in its earliest roots something that people used not only to plunder and all of those things, which of course went on all the time, particularly from the nobility. I remember reading a document that was published, that was written in the 12th century by a group of farmers and peasants asking the lord of the manor to please stop raiding them and taking their crops and promising him that they would give him a big share of what they grew if he'd just stop attacking them all the time. So So the early use of violence, besides the obvious uses that we still deal with today, was to protect against other violence. You see that in the Vikings, you see that in all the Nordic countries, old medieval stories. But as the middle class emerged in the beginning, in the early Renaissance, these were people who wanted to do business with the king, with each other. And you really have a hard time doing business if everyone around you, including the person you're trying to do business with, is prepared to beat you over the head with a club or stab you with his eating knife or whatever. The commonest source of injuries, by the way, in early medieval England was either the knife you used to eat with or a stick you picked up somewhere. Uh, so they basically, in exchange for giving the king their taxes, invited or insisted that the king protect them from violence. And he did that basically in two different ways. One was to, of course, use the military and any forces that he could gather together to go after people who are violent, to kill them or to exile them, the early development of criminal courts. The other way was to try to tamp down the violence itself. And, when Louis XIV, the great Sun King of France, decided that all the business of the state was going to be conducted at Versailles, he insisted that none of the nobility, that all the nobility who wanted to do business with the king, who controlled all the money in the country, could come to Versailles and do their business, but they had to leave their weapons at home. And you can imagine the hue and cry from these warrior types. Oh God damn, I'm not going to take my club to the king. My sword, my beautiful sword. What are we coming to? These people are all wimps, and so on and so on.
These liberals
But
destroying the country.
country's falling apart. We need to elect Trump. I mean, you can so that that's the kind of thing that went on. The church also, curiously, encouraged peaceful. So, for example, Louis XIII, who was the 14th predecessor, as a child during this transitional period, normally children were beaten every morning with a switch or a hand or a fist to teach them to be for the crime of pride, it was said, for the sin of pride. Louis XIII was routinely smacked around every morning by a big guy who was controlled by the king, who was one of the king's couriers, for the sin of pride. And he asked his mother if she could help. And she arranged so that whenever the king was out of town, which the king was a lot, because they used to go around to various estates and collect meat and animals and food and whatever they could scratch up. She, with the advice of her priest, asked that he only be beaten if he did something wrong and not simply because he's alive. But it went on to a degree when his father was assassinated when he was 8 years old. And the queen asked this, I don't know, 12-year-old boy, 8-year-old boy, what he wanted. Oh, she told him, see how much the people love you. There was great cheering going on. And he said, I'm glad that they love me, but I would really much rather not be beaten every day. So there was this interesting transitional time when violence began to be brought under control by the state in order to facilitate commerce, in order to protect the middle. I mean, imagine a modern corporation or a modern academic faculty if everyone was seriously violent. There would be bloodbaths everywhere in the factory buildings and in the corporate headquarters. Because how else would you settle disputes if you didn't have some mediation system between you? And that's where the courts of law came from. Police came in very much later. Violence had declined to almost modern low levels in Europe by the time the famous bobbies of England were brought into existence in 1828. So it was much more the invention of an alternate way to settle disputes that made it possible. However, whenever this government control system breaks down or isn't adequate, people seem to, as it were, automatically revert to these older systems, and in particular, the clan-based or family-based self-protection system. For example, in today's inner cities, where the police generally don't go into Black neighborhoods in particular in any great numbers, but sort of patrol the periphery. And maybe more to the point, where African Americans don't have the same access to the courts as people with more money and more influence and less prejudice do. The violence rates are higher. And they're higher because those communities are what Dr. Athens, Lonnie Athens, the criminologist who developed all this, calls turbulent neighborhoods, neighborhoods where there's still a contest going on between whether they're going to be violent neighborhoods or peaceful neighborhoods. This is the one in between that's unsettled, and thus you get the kind of increased levels of violence. You can see that internationally as well. People think the United States is a very violent country. In fact, it's not a very violent country. The countries in Europe have violence is usually measured in terms of 100,000 population, so you can judge across different size populations. The violence rates in most of the countries of Western Europe are around 1 to 1.5 homicides per 100,000 population. In the United States, there was an uptick during COVID because people were at home and were able to have squabbles develop among themselves more than otherwise. But the homicide rate in the United States today nationally is 5.4 per 100,000. That's a very low level if you think about it. The homicide rate in Mexico is up around 50 per 100,000. In some of our worst inner city populations, it's around 20 to 40 per 100,000. And for the whopping all-time largest of all, in Papua New Guinea, where for many years there was essentially no central government of any kind, and there's not a lot more now, the homicide rate was up around 1,000 per 100,000.
Good
So
Lord.
that when war. So that when the Australians were assigned to be the guardians of Papua New Guinea after the Second World War, they came in and put on their red judges' robes and their periwigs and said, you don't have to do this anymore. We're going to have courts and you'll be able to work out your disputes there. The reaction among the Papua New Guineans was, oh, thank God, I am so tired of watching my back all the time. So you can see a sort of a span here between peaceful societies where violent disputes have been, where disputes have been subsumed under mechanisms for peaceful resolution. You know, you pay a fine or a criminal goes to jail, whatever. And societies at the other extreme, mostly at this point in time, historical, although this occurs also when things break down in wartime. Think about the terrible genocide in Rwanda that came when the government leader was shot, his plane was shot down, and then a few violent people who were anti-Tutsi took over the radios and started broadcasting, go out and kill them all, and everybody pitched in. And some 800,000 people were killed in the course of a few months. So when breakdown comes, we tend to revert to the older systems, but we are not a particularly violent society. It looks that way because we have so much news coverage. We can much more transparent today than it used to be. But but then who are these mass killers? That's the next and interesting question. Who is this kid? How does that happen? I wrote a book about a criminologist named Dr. Lonnie Athens, who taught, he's retired now, but he taught at South New Jersey at a university of Seton Hall, taught criminology. He did an amazing thing. He went into prisons and interviewed violent felons in prison, each for about 8 to 10 hours, doing the same thing, asking them to walk back from their crime of record. He looked up their records, and if they lied about their crime of record, he threw out the interview. So as it was not a question of them just telling tall tales, he knew that they told him the truth about one, and that was much more likely that they would then tell him the truth about previous crimes, even as it happened crimes that they'd never been charged with. So he would walk them back crime by violent act until they got as far back as they could remember. And for the younger men, it was all the way back to their first violent act. And then he took all these interviews and he laid them out in front of him. And he looked for the minimum common denominator of violent social experiences they all had. This is a method that's used in looking for diseases. You look at people who have the disease and you try to figure out what's different about them from people who don't have the disease. Maybe as with malaria, you find the malaria parasite in the blood. Maybe as with, I don't know, Parkinson's, you have a group of symptoms that add up to the disease. But one way or another, you try to find what is the paradigmatic cause of that particular disease. He was doing the same thing. He's been criticized for not using the standard sort of double blind, blah, blah, blah stuff. You can't really do that with human beings when you're asking about their social experiences. So he reverted to another equally reliable system. And what he found that they all had in common was a standard pattern of about 4 to 5 stages of change, social change, leading to a re-socialization. Okay, what's socialization? Socialization is the way we develop our identities as human beings. We're first socialized by our parents to have a minimum sort of we don't poopy on the floor, and we try to keep our hands clean and so forth. We speak the same language as our parents usually, and so on. That's the way babies and infants are socialized. But when you go into, let's say, when you're going to join a fraternity, what happens? First thing that is done, and this is true in the military too. In fact, this is true in all socialization processes. The first thing that happens is that there's an attempt to break down your previous identity. This is hazing. This is boot camp. In medical students, this is the horrors of internship where you never get any sleep and you work 3 or 4 days nonstop and so forth, all the time being told how stupid you are.
Mm-hmm.
Buzz cutting your hair when you join the army, all your civilian clothes shipped back home, a whole new set of clothing, whole new group of people around you, whole new orders being given, all sorts of physical tests of ability and simple exhaustion efforts done. All of this in the interest of breaking down your previous identity. At that point, you're coached, whether by your drill sergeant or the doctor on the ward or your parents or whomever, in how you have a personal responsibility to become this other person that they're trying to turn you into. And in the case of the violent, let me revert now to violence because I think that is the basic pattern. It's clear that this happens in a lot of contexts. But Athens was looking in particular at violent socialization. So he asked for their violent experiences. And what came out was a standard pattern of, first of all, being brutalized physically or simply verbally if the person is credibly violent, like the drill sergeant, being verbally abused, physically abused, described and condemned with contempt by someone who is credibly violent himself or herself. This happens with mothers quite a lot. Lee Harvey Oswald's mother was very clearly his violent dominator.
Hitler's dad.
So not only do you get what some would call the abuse excuse, but attached to that is a constant process of coaching by direct instruction, by shaming, by bragging on the part of the violent person about how great it is to be violent. For a long time, you can't really do much about that, except get more and more bitter and more angry that other people are pushing you around all the time and are telling you basically that if you don't man up, you're going to spend the rest of your life getting pushed around by other people. At some point along the way, when you reach enough physical scale, if you will, to be able to at least begin to think about reacting to this mistreatment, there begins to be a transformation toward a limited violent resolution that the next time my dad slugs me with his fist, I'm going to grab that arm and I'm going to beat the shit out of him. I'm not going to let him keep doing this to me. But you have to be prepared for the risk that you won't succeed. And therefore, it's a scary thing to do. This is why the theory that you can watch television and become violent is just false. You don't put yourself at any risk when you're watching violent television, but you put yourself at risk of your life, if not your bones, when you decide to take action against a credibly violent dominator. So it's a very deep decision. And once it's made and tried, there are several possible outcomes. One is you can not succeed. Whoever you're attacking can win the dominance battle with you. And if that happens a few times, you may decide the violence isn't for you. Some of this is connected to the suicides of teenagers that we hear about. In fact, when homicide rates go down in society, suicide rates go up, which tells you, I think, that they're probably connected. And the connection probably comes at just this time when you're trying to decide how to deal with your violent domination. Because obviously one answer to being mistreated is to take your life. You won't be mistreated anymore. There are a lot of other answers that people. I went through this with a stepmother who was violently mistreating me as a boy, and my answer was to spend as much time in the library as possible, and also to kind of stay behind my larger older brother and hope that he would deal with the problem, which ultimately he did. So there are lots of different ways. There's a sense where this constant coaching that violence is the answer is kind of a limited piece of information for you, that if you had more credible information from nonviolent people, that you might be able to find another way out. This, I think, explains the success of anti-bullying programs in schools. They work remarkably well, even though most of them are not based on this model, which I think is the model of how people become violent. In any case, that's what happens if you don't succeed. If you do succeed, if you succeed in beating up the guy who is beating you up, if you succeed in pushing away the violent dominator who's been ruling your life, there is an enormous emotional transformation. Just think about it. You've been pushed around, you've been whipped, you've been knocked on the head, your eyes been blackened or whatever by someone in your life or many people in your life. And now suddenly you're the person who can do that. And at that point, the willingness to become someone who's prepared to use serious violence when challenged is overwhelming. And most people take that. Or as a violent felon told my wife in a prison interview that she conducted with violent felons, she's been writing about and working with violent people. She's a psychologist. He said, yeah, when I walk down the street, people get out of the way. And that's one of the rewards for the whole thing. It's not automatic. It's not impulsive. It's not merely because you're angry. You have a lot of possible reasons why people might be prepared to use violence. But the first transformation is to defensive violence. And that's not surprisingly, where we train our military and our police. We want them to be prepared to use serious violence to defend themselves and to protect the rest of us. But we don't want them to use it against people who aren't threatening ourselves or the rest of us. That's where we like to keep police and soldiers at that level. And there are all sorts of mechanisms that we've invented over the centuries. Pride in being a Marine, a whole code of laws that are special to the military that say basically, if you use violence against people who are not threatening you, that's a crime. But if you use violence in a military context, that's not a crime. In fact, that's a heroic act and will give you a medal. Speaking of endorsements of using violence. So, however, a certain subset of people who become defensively violent, who don't think of themselves, by the way, as violent people, they just think of themselves as prepared to use violence if necessary for protection. But there's a subset who gets so carried away. Maybe they were particularly brutally dominated. I don't know. Athens research didn't turn up any that reason, whatever it might be. There's a subset who suddenly realize that if it works so well to use violence against people who are threatening you with serious violence themselves, then it would work beautifully for people who aren't threatening you, who are too weak to threaten you, or who don't have a weapon in their hands. And then you can do things like take what they have, their money, whatever. You can rape them if you don't like them. You can all sorts of possibilities open up. That person now is a violent criminal. By any definition in any society, that person is a violent criminal. That's the model that Athens developed in his interviews with real violent criminals. And as you and I have talked about, you know that I thought, how could we test this in a different context? And I went looking for a different place and found the SS Einsatz group and the special forces that Hitler deployed early in World War II to murder the Jews behind the lines as the German army advanced into the Soviet Union. They were ordinary police and SS soldiers. And when they were ordered in the summer of 1941 to start killing women and children, they went off the rails. They weren't prepared. They had been conditioned to be defensively violent, and they could believe that Jewish men of military age were somehow guerrilla forces of a kind and killed them with impunity. But when they were asked to kill little babies and mothers and children and so forth, they began to have breakdowns. They began to turn into drunks. And worst of all, from the point of view of Heinrich Himmler, who ran the SS, some of them began to enjoy the violence, began to go out on their own looking for Jews to kill. He was repelled by that. He thought that was bestial, and which tells us he really was not totally violent himself. He was a desk murderer, someone who could get all the violent notoriety he could ever want just by ordering other people to kill. And out of that came the invention of the gas chamber and the death camps as a way of reducing the trauma to the perpetrators. So that was a test of Athens' model in a different world at a different time with different people. And it matched up beautifully. They had been through a military institutional version of the same thing. So what do we say about this kid? Someone violently dominated him. From the little information that's out available now, it very much looks like it was in high school, and it was all his high school classmates. He was relentlessly bullied all through high school, according to fellow students who saw it happen. And he didn't fight back. He was also very bright, which tells you normally when someone is relentlessly bullied like that, a very few of them get to the point because they've had some other violent socialization around them in their lives, decide to take a gun and go to school and shoot up those classmates that were attacking them all the time, that were threatening them all the time. This kid had a bigger idea, which was to make himself, give himself historic violent notoriety. He was going to kill an ex-president, and his name, he knew, would go down in history if he did so. And that indeed is what he tried to do. And had Trump, as the former president has acknowledged lately, had Trump not turned his head to look at the bulletin board where the poster was, the bullet would have hit him right in the middle of his head.
Killed him instantly.
I am struck once more, just as an historian, by how something so seemingly small as a little bomb core, there it is,
Mhm.
a little bomb core, bullet, a head turned at the last second, can change the course of human history.
Truly.
Imagine if he killed. Imagine now that he wasn't killed. Imagine how that's going to change the whole political calculation of our country in the months to come. One way or the other, who knows how? It's just extraordinary. And it leaves me, Steven Weinberg, the Nobel laureate theoretical physicist, was my landlord in Cambridge, Massachusetts, many years ago. We rented his house when we first moved there. I was doing some research at Harvard. And Weinberg was someone who wrote once that the more he understood physics and particularly astrophysics, the more the world seemed pointless to him. And although this is not pointless, I defy anyone to find any particular meaning in a bullet that just went through someone's ear one day and changed the course of history. I mean, it matches up with similar assassinations in the past. Lincoln, uh, the Archduke who was
Mhm.
killed that began one, over and over again. You see these things happening. I don't know what to say, except history turns out to be a kind of writing history turns out to be a kind of fiction, if
Yeah.
you will.
There was a,
It's
I forget who it was by. There was an author I had on last year, I think. I'm trying to remember his name. But his book was Tiny Blunders That Changed the Course of History. I'll look on my phone right now. It's got to be there. But he talks about just that. Then he goes through Hitler assassination attempts to, I mean, and it's not even all like death. Sometimes it's just like an investor sitting next to the bus on a guy with who just, invented XYZ, or just these things of, a flight was changed, and, just
yes,
these little tiny just these little tiny movements, and it's not. And maybe you could argue these things happen nonstop all day every day. We don't really appreciate them until it happens to an ex-president, Archduke Ferdinand. So I mean, that would, be the devil's advocate, but I mean, it's not. It's absolutely incredible, and I don't think any emotionally and intellectually mature person, regardless of political stance, wanted the president to be ex-president to be killed on Saturday. The ensuing violence would have engulfed us all, and there is something that but it's also not. It's There isn't a lack of historical precedence. I mean, I always forget his name, the Soviet submariner during the Cuban Missile Crisis who wouldn't return fire on what they. I mean, little things like that should have. I mean, bombing Nagasaki, weren't they were supposed to go for Kyoto, I think, right? Or I don't forget which. But it was demanded that they had visual contact and they couldn't see it. I mean,
yes.
that
Well,
stuff does happen.
yeah, yes. Randomness and chance. What is the line? It's from Ecclesiastes, for time and chance happeneth to us all. Indeed, they do.
It's the book, by the way, The Blunders That Changed the World by Jarrett Knott, Knott. Yeah, no,
Good.
he's got tons of them. I remember reading the book, and it was almost I totally understood why he wrote the book, because I think he said he was like he learned about one and then looked for like another instance, and then found a second. Was like, that's interesting. And he started, and he's like, in the last 150 years, there's been like a dozen of these things where it's, I mean, truly, I'm not as well versed on the Hitler assassination attempt, but even when he was in World War One, I mean, wasn't he buried by dirt from an artillery shell? Like Adolf Hitler should have
Oh,
died
he
there.
may
It's
well
just,
have been.
I mean,
Well,
yeah,
he was almost assassinated, and he happened to be on the other side of a
the
very heavy
like oak table.
uh,
Yeah, I mean,
table that protected him from the worst effects of the blast. So again and again, assassinations form a very special place in our in American history as well as world history,
sure.
exactly because such sharp little hinges with everything to it tells us something. You know, one of the things I've never really thought my way completely through, but that's always intrigued me, is the extent to which these leaders of ours have deep connections to something I guess I'd have to call mammalian in us all. I mean, it's a kind of a commonplace of politics that no one under 6 feet tall can be elected
Yeah,
president.
yeah, right, right.
The exception was Jimmy Carter. And I don't know how he pulled that off, but I do remember reading that John Kennedy, who was 6 feet 1, wore lifts in his shoes to make him even taller because he understood about this particular prejudice.
I'm
you see pictures. You see pictures of the head of Ukraine, who's not a very tall man, around all the leaders of Europe, and they're all six
mm,
feet three. They are. He's found a compromise, which is to wear his military fatigues in
sure.
all these as a way of saying, I may not be as tall as you, but God damn it, I'm just as tough as you. So it's amazing how much these things play a part in. I mean, Donald Trump and his amazing hair, which was kind of revealed by the bullet wind as it blew by. It's entirely on one side of his head now,
Sure.
and he grows it 1.5 feet long and then flips it over. It's
There-
because he understands it would look different if his baldness were revealed.
Sure.
It's just there's some level way deeper than words or
No,
party or language.
there's a deep reptilian.
Yeah,
We're
where we
still animals. We're still, you gotta, you gotta be clean shape. You gotta show a jawbone. You gotta, we are deeply still animals. And I was gonna say, just thinking, yeah, Reagan, wasn't it like a quarter of an inch from his heart? And Andrew Jackson, two pistols misfire. I mean, there
uh,
are there
yeah,
are shooting star chances that change history. But Mr. Rhodes, I don't mean to wrap this one up rather abruptly, but like I told, I gotta take a doctor phone call in 2 minutes, and I'm an idiot and should have scheduled that later, so I apologize. But yeah,
profound subject. I hope people work on who need scholarly work to do.
yeah,
There's a lot more. Athens model, I think, is the right one. All the baloney about being that we talked about how people become violent is really not true. It's kind of like the argument that the swamp put out exhalations that cause malaria. Well, yeah, they were called mosquitoes, you know.
you did very true.
Time.
Well, Mr. Rhodes, as always, it's a pleasure. I was gonna, and one more thing, I was gonna say, yeah, look at pictures of Elon Musk, early 2000s. He was completely balding, and now he's got a full. I mean, that he threw some serious money at hair play. Why? They're the mammalian. We are still these animals, but we will pick this up on a future stream. I would imagine we're gonna have a lot more to talk about in the coming months. But thank you very much for coming on today for the 79th anniversary. I'm absolutely tickled to have gotten to talk to you on today, and as always, I legitimately appreciate your time, sir.
I enjoy talking to you, Tommy.
Yes, sir. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Rhodes. Guys, please go to the description. Please go grab any of his books, and I'll text you this up or email you this episode. And I look forward to the next time we talk. Thank you so much, Mr. Rhodes.